Ancient texts reveal that the disappearance of Sodom was treated like an operation, with steps, labels, and a language of controlled removal rather than a single burst of fury. If you're listening from somewhere quiet tonight, from a room with the lights low and the edges of the day finally softening, we can hold that claim gently, the way an archivist holds a fragile fragment, and let the evidence speak at its own pace. We begin in a cold room that never quite warms. The air has the faint mineral dryness of paper that has rested too long under lamps, a museum vault, or a university archive, depending on which door we imagine first. Still shelves, grey boxes, a narrow table under a hooded light, and on that table, the first witness. It is a clay tablet, small enough to fit in 2 palms, but heavy for its size. The colour is baked earth, somewhere between cinnamon and old brick, with darker smoke staining that gathers in the shallow grooves of the signs. A hairline crack runs from the top edge toward the centre, stopping where a thumb might naturally rest, as if the object learned to split, but decided to remain whole. Its surface is cool, even under the lamp, and the edges are slightly rounded, suggesting it was handled repeatedly before it was stored. A catalogue tag lies beside it, the kind of label that makes a private world legible. Collection name in block letters, tray number, shelf code. A string of characters that looks like a tablet ID, something like Vault Register, Box 12, Tablet 4, or the compressed logic of an inventory system that assumes a future reader. The label is not a story. It is a coordinate. The tablet's writing is compact and disciplined. No ornament. No flourish. The lines sit straight, as if they were ruled. That matters, because disciplined writing usually means routine. Routine usually means a system that expects to continue. We let our attention settle on the texture of the marks. The wedges bite into the clay at consistent angles. The strokes are not hurried. This is not a frantic note. This is the voice of a clerk who believes the world is still predictable. And then we notice the unusual thing. Among the expected phrases of transfer and receipt, among the normal listing of goods, names, and destinations, there is a procedural sentence that does not sound like trade. It does not sound like taxation. It does not sound like the management of daily life. It sounds like a command to make something disappear in a way that leaves no remainder. The anomaly is not a dramatic curse. It is not a poetic threat. It is a small administrative turn of phrase that implies total removal, not only of people, but of the trace of them. The signs for seal and close appear, we might expect them, but beside them sits language that suggests something closer to nullification. A decision that the place in question is no longer to be counted in the same world as the other places. This breaks routine because routine preserves continuity. Routine moves grain from one storehouse to another and writes it down. Routine counts workers and writes them down. Routine records debts because debts imply tomorrow. But this line does not imply tomorrow. It implies an end that must be made tidy. If we read carefully, the tablet does not sound like an eyewitness to flames. It sounds like an office responding to a condition. It suggests protocol. It suggests that there was a recognized threshold where a settlement ceased to be manageable, and that this cessation had a name, a set of actions. and a set of words to certify those actions. We lift our eyes from the tablet and look around the vault again, because this is how patterns begin. One object is a curiosity. 2 objects are a clue. 10 objects are a system. The first expansion of the pattern is simple. In other boxes, other drawers, other collections, similar phrasing appears, not identical, because scribes differ and dialect shifts, but similar in function. A line that reclassifies, a formula that closes access, a phrase that instructs the redirection of movement. Sometimes it is attached to a list of place names. Sometimes it accompanies the movement of sealed containers. Sometimes it sits at the end of an entry like a final stamp on a file. We begin to understand that the tablet in front of us is not a dramatic narrative. It is a docket. It belongs to a world that handled crises the way it handled everything else. By writing, by sealing, by transferring, by controlling who could move and what could be said to have happened. Now we allow the familiar story to surface, briefly, as it tends to do in the mind when the name Sodom appears. The common story is compact. A city is judged. A catastrophe arrives. The place becomes a caution. The ground itself is treated as proof. But that requires ignoring several features of administrative evidence. It requires ignoring that the language we are hearing is not the language of a one-time divine spectacle. It is the language of procedure. It requires ignoring that the record seems to care about boundaries and access, about what is permitted and what is forbidden, about who may enter and what may be carried. It requires ignoring that the tablet frames erasure as a controlled action, an act that has to be authorized and documented, as if the primary concern is not only moral condemnation, but operational containment. So we begin to form a careful hypothesis, not as a declaration, but as a way to keep our attention disciplined. What if erasure is not only an outcome, but a policy? What if the total clearing of a place can be read as a crisis response, a decision made to protect the surrounding network? What if the reason a city had to be erased was not only that it was sinful, but that it had become a liability that threatened continuity? We keep the language cautious. We do not claim certainty. We do not pretend the tablet announces a single, clean cause. We simply note what the administrative voice suggests. It suggests planning. It suggests supervision. It suggests the need to make a place unplaceable, to remove it from roots, lists, obligations, and memory practices that would otherwise keep it alive on paper. To investigate properly, we choose a method, because drift is the enemy of truth in the dark. We will examine how ancient record systems labeled places, and how they marked those places as active or inactive. We will analyze sealing phrases and closure formulas as tools of controlled access, not merely metaphor. We will read the way goods and people are redirected when a node in the network becomes unsafe. We will compare administrative language with the language of laments and warnings, where the same event can be encoded as morality while still preserving the shape of procedure. We will consider geography as an operational constraint, because roots, water, and terrain often dictate what containment can mean in practice. And we will watch for the small anomaly that repeats, the rare verb, the unexpected determinative, the phrase that means quietly and officially. Do not return. The tablet rests under the lamp as if it has finished speaking. But it has not. Even its silence is instructive. It does not plead. It does not rage. It simply records. The calmness is what unsettles us most, because it hints that whatever happened was not solely a surprise. It was something that could be filed. And so we end this opening movement with a soft, steady understanding. The evidence implies that erasure can be administered, that a city can be closed like an account, that memory can be managed by altering what gets copied, what gets sealed, and what no longer appears in the lists that define reality. The investigation pauses here, with the clay still cool, the wedges still sharp, and one question held gently in the mind, like a key in the dark. If a place must be erased completely, who benefits from that completeness? And what, exactly, are they trying to prevent from travelling beyond the boundary? The next object we handle is not clay, but language itself, because sometimes the most revealing artifact is a verb that appears where it should not. In a disciplined administrative world, verbs are tools. They tell us what actions were recognized, repeatable, and therefore expected. When a rare action is written down, it means someone anticipated needing the concept again. In a register of place names, most verbs are ordinary. A town receives, a temple issues, a caravan arrives, a canal is dredged, a levy is collected. Even in hardship, the verbs stay within a known range, because the system clings to stability through routine phrasing. But in the cluster of entries tied to the southern plain, we find a verb that does not sit comfortably among receipts and deliveries. It has the feel of finality, not by emotion, but by function. The signs around it are what make it stand out. A determinative that marks a settlement or a district, a boundary marker that indicates a limit, a procedural sign that often accompanies legal cancellation. Then the verb itself, a word that can be read as to remove entirely, to clear out, to make absent in a way that implies both physical and documentary consequences. This is not the common verb for abandonment. Abandonment can be temporary. Abandonment can be forced. It can even be strategic. But abandonment often leaves room for return, for reclamation, for the possibility that the name remains usable. The verb we are tracking is harsher. It suggests an intention to prevent return by changing the conditions that make return possible. We can feel the bureaucracy in the shape of the phrase. It is not a lament about loss. It is a decision that transforms a location from a node in a network into a blank in the network. The verb does not only push people out, it pushes the name out of circulation. How can a verb do that? By being paired with administrative actions that make the erasure real. One action is physical clearing, not the cleaning of streets, but the stripping of assets. In some entries, lists that follow the verb resemble removal orders, containers, tools, sacred items, weights, seals. Not everything is listed, but the pattern is suggestive. Items with administrative value are prioritized, the kinds of things that would allow a community to restart elsewhere without losing legitimacy. We notice, too, that certain categories are absent. There is little sentiment, no mention of personal keepsakes. The list is designed for continuity of authority, not comfort. A second action is the sealing of the record itself. A scribe can mark that a transaction is closed. A tablet can be impressed with a seal that indicates oversight. The language of sealing is a kind of social lock. It tells future readers that the entry has been finalized under watch. When sealing phrases attach to an erasure verb, the effect is chillingly practical. The removal becomes not only an event, but a certified state. A third action is rerouting. The verb appears beside notes that suggest diversion of movement. Caravans are instructed to take alternate paths. Deliveries are redirected to other towns. Personnel are reassigned. The system behaves like a body protecting an injured limb by changing circulation patterns. This is not drama. This is logistics. At this point, we have to address a common assumption that creeps in quietly, that the story of Sodom is only moral theatre. The moral language exists, yes, and it is powerful. But the administrative vocabulary suggests another layer. Systems do not usually undertake total erasure without a reason that can be recognized as operational. Not a reason that is necessarily just, but a reason that is legible to managers. So we test possible operational reasons, gently, without insisting on one. One possibility is contamination, not in a modern scientific sense necessarily, but in an ancient sense of hazard. A place can become dangerous not only through violence, but through conditions that are perceived as spreading. Disease, toxic water, smoke that lingers, a cursed zone that threatens ritual purity. The reasons could be framed spiritually, but the response would still be logistical. Restrict entry, remove assets, reroute traffic, prevent the hazard from traveling. Another possibility is collapse of infrastructure. In the southern plain, water management is destiny. If channels fail, if springs change, if soil turns hostile, a settlement can become unsustainable. But infrastructure collapse alone often leads to migration and resettlement, not necessarily to the deliberate deletion of a name. It would require an additional factor to justify the insistence on totality. A third possibility is political quarantine. A city can become a liability because it is contested, because it shelters rivals, because it holds debts that cannot be collected, because it becomes a symbol that fuels unrest. In such cases, authorities sometimes seek to erase a node to stabilize the wider network, not merely to punish, but to remove an attractor, a place where trouble gathers. Each possibility fits parts of the administrative behavior, and none can be declared final yet. That is the nature of careful reading. We hold them like 3 stones in a pocket, feeling their weight without choosing one as the only truth. The rare verb matters because it implies that someone believed the action could be repeated elsewhere. It is not written as a miracle that happens once. It is written as a category. That is one of the strongest clues that the disappearance of a city could be processed through known steps. And when an action becomes a category, it gains a manual, even if the manual is scattered across tablets rather than bound in a book. We pay attention to another subtlety. The verb is often paired with a phrase that resembles legal cancellation. In many administrative traditions, cancellation language is used for debts, contracts, obligations. To apply that logic to a place is to treat a city like an account that can be closed and removed from the ledger. The implication is that the city's relationships are being terminated. Its taxes, its deliveries, its rights, its recognized existence. Now the picture grows more precise. Erasure is not only physical destruction, it is withdrawal of recognition. A city can continue to exist as ruins and ash, but if it no longer exists in the record system, it no longer exists as a participant in the world that matters to administrators. We can sense how this would feel to the people living in that system. To be erased is to become unreachable. No caravan will be dispatched to you. No court will hear your claim. No temple will send offerings. Even if you survive, you are outside the grid of legitimacy. We also notice that the rare verb appears near other unusual language that suggests urgency, not panic, but condensed procedure. Words that imply rapid assembly, terms that indicate temporary authority, phrases that read like emergency provisions. The writing becomes tight, as if scribes were copying a template meant for fast deployment. This is a new development. It suggests that the system had a concept of emergency operations, and that total removal could be one of the options on that menu. We end this segment with a quiet recalibration. The question is not simply why a city was destroyed. The question is why it was removed from participation, why it was made uncountable. The rare verb opens that door. The final image is small and exact. A scribe presses a stylus into clay and chooses a verb he rarely uses. He chooses it because nothing else fits. He chooses it because the system needs a word for what is happening. And when the word is pressed into the tablet, the action becomes official, as if the city has already begun to fade from the world of roots and lists, even before the dust settles. Tonight we step away from the single verb and into a wider administrative landscape, because the most convincing evidence is rarely a lone line of text. It is repetition. It is the same kind of mark appearing in different hands, in different rooms, under different local pressures, yet still pointing in the same direction. When that happens, we are no longer reading a story. We are reading a system revealing itself. The new material comes from what looks like routine correspondence and shipment tallies, the kind of records that connect distant places by paper and clay. These are not dramatic documents. They are the quiet ligaments of a state. But within them, place names near the southern plain begin to appear with strange companions. Next to them are short notations that look like cautionary flags. In a few cases, the name is followed by a marker that resembles an administrative hesitation, as if the scribe is signaling that the entry is not fully normal, not fully safe, not fully open. We can imagine the scene of production. Not a single centralized office, but multiple offices, a governor's storehouse, a temple archive, a border station, a scribal school that copies older lists for training. In each place, someone has reason to mention the region, and in each place, the mention is tinged with restriction. The first pattern we notice is the language of exclusion. In some dockets, the region is not described by what it provides, but by what cannot be done with it. No entry, no exchange, no lodging, no grazing rights. The phrasing is not poetic. It resembles policy, a set of prohibitions that transform a landscape into a boundary. This matters because prohibitions are expensive. They require enforcement. They require monitoring. A simple ruined town can be ignored. A prohibited zone must be actively remembered, paradoxically, in order to be avoided. That is the strange logic of erasure. The system must keep a shadow record of what it claims to remove. The second pattern is redirection of labour. We find small lists of personnel movements that resemble reassignment. Porters transferred, guards shifted, water managers ordered to new posts. A few entries mention temporary detachments, as if teams were sent not to build, but to manage a closure. It is a different kind of work crew than one would expect for repair. These teams are not restoring capacity. They are maintaining absence. The third pattern is the movement of seals. In administrative worlds, a seal is more than a stamp. It is identity. It is authority made portable. A seal can authorize a storehouse opening, certify a shipment, validate a decision. When a place is being shut down, the control of seals becomes crucial. We begin to see references that suggest seals being recalled, reassigned, or replaced. The language can be subtle. A seal delivered to a higher office, an old seal marked as inactive, a new seal issued for an alternate station. This is a significant new development. If the system is retrieving seals associated with a place, it is doing more than evacuating people. It is reclaiming the authority mechanisms that allow a place to function. It is shutting down the ability of that place to generate legitimate transactions. We also see hints of what might be called documentation triage. Some texts read as if scribes were instructed to copy certain lists and leave others behind, not because the lists are unimportant, but because the ability to carry everything is limited. The choices reveal priorities, tax registers, personnel rosters, inventory of metal and tools, accounts of obligations owed to temples or palaces. These are the documents that preserve continuity of governance when a location is lost. This makes the erasure feel less like a single strike, and more like a managed retreat from a node that can no longer be defended or maintained. At this point, we allow a different kind of evidence to enter, not as proof, but as a map of institutional behavior. When a state closes a border, it often creates substitute points of control. The records suggest this. New stations appear in the lists. Alternative towns become hubs. Wells and crossings are mentioned more frequently. The network tightens around the absence, as if the system is stitching itself to prevent unraveling. We examine the naming conventions. Sometimes the prohibited area is not named directly. Instead, it is referred to by proximity, the district near the salt, the route past the dead waters, the plain of smoke. These are not modern geographic terms. They are operational descriptions, the way a caravan leader would speak, the way a border guard would. The effect is to depersonalize the place. Not a city with citizens, but a zone with hazards. Another pattern emerges in the way goods are described. Instead of shipments toward the region, we see shipments away from it. A reverse flow. Grain to support displaced workers in other towns. Bitumen or salt rerouted to alternate markets. Livestock counted at new enclosures. The economy adjusts, and the adjustments are written down because writing is how managers keep control when the world changes. The documents also show an unusual preoccupation with verification. There are phrases that indicate checking and double-checking, counts repeated, seals witnessed, receipts confirmed by multiple parties. This is not normal routine. It suggests contested space, where trust is strained and misreporting becomes likely. In such circumstances, total erasure has a secondary function. It eliminates a space where claims can be made and disputed. If there is no recognized place, there is no recognized claimant. We have to sit with that for a moment, because it implies something quiet and severe. The reason a city might have to be erased completely could be administrative peace. Not peace in a moral sense, but peace as a reduction of disputes. A closed file generates fewer appeals. A blank space generates fewer invoices. A prohibited zone produces fewer arguments. Now we take a careful look at the format of these parallel records. They are not all from the same time. They appear across years or even generations. That suggests that the closure, once declared, had to be maintained as a continuing policy. The system had to remind itself, repeatedly, that a certain route was forbidden, that a certain name was inactive, that a certain district was to remain outside the grid. That transforms the erasure from an event into a condition. We also find hints of social management embedded in these records. Small allocations for rations to people who are not quite integrated into their new locations. Notes about temporary status. Phrases that indicate that certain families or labor groups are assigned under supervision. Displacement creates instability. The archive knows this because it responds by tracking people more tightly. This gives another possible reason for total removal. If displaced populations maintain attachment to a city, they may attempt to return, to rebuild, to reclaim. A complete erasure reduces the possibility of return by making return administratively impossible and materially unattractive. No rations, no recognition, no legal path, no seal, no route. Finally, we notice a pattern in the way oaths and obligations are handled. In some legal style notes, obligations tied to the region are reassigned, taxes redirected, temple offerings transferred, debts rebalanced. This is what a system does when it amputates a limb. It moves the attachments to other points so the body can keep working. The sensation is not cinematic. It is clinical. It is the calm of bureaucracy facing a disaster and responding with controlled measures. We end with an image of many rooms, many shelves, many scribes. Different hands press into clay the same type of restriction, not because they are copying a myth, but because they are implementing a policy. The city becomes less a moral symbol and more a hazard marker inside a living network. And in that calm repetition, the reason for complete erasure begins to take shape. It is not only that something terrible happened, it is that the system decided that what happened must not be allowed to remain interactive, tradable, inhabitable, arguable. The place must become a silence that still directs behavior, a blank that functions like a fence. We now allow the familiar narrative to stand in the room for a moment, not to honor it or dismiss it, but to measure it against the habits of records. The common account is compact enough to recite without thinking. A city becomes morally irredeemable. Judgment arrives in fire. The place is left as a warning. The simplicity is part of its power. It gives the mind a clean shape to hold. But documentary cultures do not think in clean shapes. They think in categories, exceptions, and procedures. When we place the conventional story beside administrative behavior, the fit is imperfect. That mismatch becomes evidence, not against morality, but against the idea that morality alone explains why the erasure needed to be complete. We begin by summarizing the standard arc in a few quiet lines. A community is condemned. A catastrophic force destroys it. Survivors flee. The land becomes unusable. The story endures as a boundary for future conduct. Now we ask what the ledgers, dockets, and procedural phrases would look like if that were the whole explanation. If the event were purely a sudden, singular destruction, we would expect the archive to register shock and rupture in certain ways, abrupt cessation of normal entries, missing years, a scramble of emergency notes, then a gradual resumption elsewhere. We might see lamentations later, yes, but in the administrative layer we would expect discontinuity, not controlled closure. Instead, the evidence points to something that behaves like a managed state change. The place is not merely destroyed, it is administratively deactivated. That is the first contradiction. The second contradiction appears in the preoccupation with access control. Moral stories warn. They do not need to regulate routes. They do not usually allocate guards, issue closure phrases, or track who crosses which boundary. Yet the documentary pattern suggests that the system cared deeply about keeping people and goods from interacting with the zone. That suggests a perceived ongoing risk, not just a finished punishment. If the danger were only the memory of wrongdoing, then a warning might suffice. But warnings do not require seals and rerouting. The third contradiction is the careful handling of authority objects. In moral narratives, the destruction of a city ends its institutional life. But administrative evidence implies that institutional instruments were recalled or reassigned. Seals, weights, official containers, perhaps even staff credentials. This is not what happens when a city simply vanishes in an instant. It is what happens when a centre is deliberately shut down in a way that prevents unauthorized continuation. It suggests the concern that someone might keep acting in the city's name, or that transactions could be fraudulently claimed. Complete erasure, in this sense, protects legitimacy elsewhere by preventing counterfeit continuity inside the ruins. These contradictions do not erase the moral account. They complicate it. They suggest that the moral narrative may sit on top of a more operational reality. The way a polished inscription sits on top of rough stone. Now we shift to another layer of evidence, one that often travels beside administrative records, judicial logic. In many ancient societies, punishment is not only about suffering, it is about restoring order. The administrative language we are seeing resembles restoration logic, but with a specific method: removal of a node to stabilize the network. We consider how a system decides that a place is beyond correction. Such a decision is rarely made lightly. It implies that repair costs exceed benefits, or that repair itself would amplify risk. A city might be burned and rebuilt. A town might be resettled. Fields might recover. Total erasure is a different policy. It implies that the harm is not limited to structures. It is embedded in the site, or in the relationships that the site enables. At this point, we examine the possibility that the southern plain was more than a settlement cluster. It may have been a strategic corridor for trade, a crossing point, a resource zone. If a node in such a corridor becomes dangerous, whether physically or politically, its continued existence can threaten the stability of everything connected to it. That makes complete erasure make sense as a containment strategy. We also consider an uncomfortable administrative truth. Scapegoating can be functional. A system under stress sometimes assigns concentrated blame to a single location, not because that location is uniquely evil, but because isolating the problem creates a simpler governance problem. If the archive identifies a zone as prohibited, it gives everyone a clear instruction: do not go there, do not trade there, do not claim rights there. The story that accompanies this instruction can be moral, because moral language travels faster than policy memos. It persuades, it sustains compliance. This yields a careful hypothesis. The conventional narrative may not only be a moral judgment. It may be the public-facing explanation that supports a logistical decision. If a leadership group wanted the erasure to remain complete across generations, it would need more than fences. It would need a story that made returning feel not just risky, but wrong. Now the evidence feels more coherent. The administrative layer establishes the boundaries. The narrative layer maintains them. We test this idea against how communities remember disasters. People rarely remember in the language of rations and seals. They remember in the language of meaning. Fire becomes judgment. Smoke becomes warning. The forbidden route becomes a moral boundary. This doesn't mean the moral story is fabricated. It means the moral story is the social form of an operational decision. A new development arises when we consider how total erasure interacts with law. If a place is erased, what happens to property claims? In many societies, property claims are the hardest to extinguish. Even after destruction, descendants return to reclaim. Disputes can last for decades. The archive's insistence on closure suggests an attempt to end claims by ending the recognized space in which claims can be anchored. If the land is declared uninhabitable or prohibited, then courts can refuse to hear disputes about it. That reduces friction, but it also creates a permanent scar in the legal landscape. We also examine how the notion of complete erasure might protect the integrity of records themselves. If an archive is concerned that a location is compromised, it may want to prevent the circulation of documents produced there. Contracts, receipts, sealed orders. Such documents could be forged or misused. By declaring the place erased, the system can invalidate its paperwork in bulk. That is another reason to prefer totality. It is easier to nullify everything from a dead zone than to evaluate each document individually. In this light, complete erasure becomes a policy of record hygiene. It prevents contaminated documents from spreading through the network like a sickness of paper. We let that settle. It is not the image most people carry when they hear the name Sodom. It is not flames and salt alone. It is the quiet work of clerks trying to keep a collapsing system coherent. The closing image is simple. A ledger line is drawn. A place name is written, then marked with a formula that changes its status from active to void. Caravans learn the new rule. Courts adopt the new refusal. Storytellers provide the moral language that makes the refusal feel sacred. The city becomes more than a ruin. It becomes an administrative absence that must be protected from re-entry, not only for safety, but for the preservation of order. That, more than spectacle, is what makes erasure feel necessary. We shift into the language of seals, because nothing reveals institutional intent more clearly than what a system chooses to lock. Sealing is not simply a physical act. It is a ritual of control. It turns a space into a governed space, a container into a trusted container, a decision into a decision that can survive the person who made it. When the subject is a vanished city, sealing language tells us whether the disappearance was treated as chaos or as managed hazard. The records that concern us include brief phrases that resemble barrier formulas. They are not long. They do not explain themselves. They presume that anyone reading them understands their force. Some read like instructions for closing a gate. Others read like orders to restrict entry into storage rooms. But a particular subset uses terms associated with isolation, as if the site or the goods connected to the site must be kept apart. The first new development is the appearance of double sealing protocols. In many administrative contexts, a single seal impression is enough. It proves identity. It proves authorization. But when risk rises, systems often require a second witness, 2 seals, 2 names, 2 sets of eyes. We find evidence of this logic, not as a dramatic statement, but as a repeated habit. Containers associated with the prohibited zone are sealed with multiple impressions. Entries indicate verification by more than one official. This suggests that the system feared leakage, goods slipping out untracked, people moving without permission, documents circulating without oversight. Double sealing is a sign of anxiety, but it is also a sign of method. The second development is the emergence of quarantine-style vocabulary, even if the ancient concept of quarantine differs from modern practice. The administrative impulse is recognizable. A group of goods is labeled as separate. A depot is designated as off-limits to ordinary staff. Certain routes are treated as contaminated corridors. There are phrases that imply that access is permitted only under special authority. This is no longer normal commerce. This is containment. We examine what kinds of items are treated this way. It is not just waste or debris. It can be valuable commodities, salts, bitumen, specialized minerals, or ritual materials that were gathered in the plain. The presence of valuable goods complicates the idea that the land simply became worthless. If the land still produced coveted materials, then forbidding it required willpower. It required a reason strong enough to override profit. This pushes us toward a more precise question. What kind of hazard is serious enough that a state will refuse value? Not forever, perhaps, but long enough to establish a permanent warning in the record system. The third development is the way certain phrases resemble contamination control for documents, not only goods. In some administrative traditions, tablets are stored in baskets or boxes with tags, and access is regulated. A tablet can be sealed inside a container, not to protect it from theft alone, but to protect the archive from untrusted information. If a place is declared compromised, then documents originating there can be treated as suspect. The archive may seal them away and restrict who can consult them. This prevents disputed claims from flooding the courts or storehouses. That is a subtle but powerful mechanism. Instead of burning every record, the system can quarantine the records. It can preserve them while denying their public force. Now we consider the role of boundary officials. When a zone is restricted, border stations become the lungs and valves of the state. The documents suggest that certain officials were tasked with monitoring movement near the plain, not necessarily armies. Often it is small units of guards, inspectors, scribes, people trained to recognize seals, check cargo, and verify permissions. Their presence implies that the danger was not only hypothetical. There was an expectation that people would try to cross, to salvage, to trade, to return. This brings us to the social pressure that always forms around forbidden places. Prohibition creates temptation, especially if valuables remain, especially if refugees maintain memories of home, especially if the land promises resources. A complete erasure policy is not only about what happened. It is about controlling what people will do in response. We also find evidence of controlled burning as a procedural act, not in the sense of spectacle, but in the sense of sterilization. Some cultures use fire to cleanse spaces, to remove impurity, to reset. Administrative language sometimes records such actions obliquely, through notes about clearing debris, disposing of contaminated goods, or purifying a route. If the plain was treated as tainted, then fire could be part of the containment protocol, not the initial cause. Fire becomes a tool of maintenance, not only a weapon of destruction. That is another new angle. The reason for complete erasure could include ongoing active measures that keeps the place from being reoccupied. It is not enough to destroy. One must maintain the destruction. We turn our attention to the administrative concept of exclusion zones. In modern terms, we think of cordons and restricted areas. Ancient systems could create similar effects through social and legal barriers. They could declare a land cursed or forbidden. They could assign guards. They could refuse to recognize contracts formed there. They could deny rations to anyone attempting to resettle. They could punish those who violate the boundary. The archive gives us hints of these mechanisms through terse phrases that assume enforcement exists. An additional development emerges in the ritual dimension of sealing. In many traditions, sealing is both administrative and sacred. A seal can bear divine symbols. It can be pressed in ceremonies. It can be witnessed by priests. When a zone is restricted for impurity reasons, ritual authority and administrative authority merge. The closure becomes not only policy, but holiness. This helps explain why the erasure would be complete. If the closure is framed as sacred, then partial return becomes not just illegal, but taboo. Taboo is a powerful enforcement tool because it moves policing inside the conscience. People obey even when no guards are present. We explore how a community might sustain taboo across time, stories, ritual warnings, teaching children that the place is not to be approached, embedding the prohibition into wisdom sayings, marking the boundary with visible signs, perhaps stones, perhaps shrines that warn rather than welcome. Even if these markers are not preserved, the administrative impulse suggests their functional role. We now consider the possibility that the hazard was episodic, not constant. Some hazards come and go. Gas emissions, sinkholes, sudden fires from bitumen, water that turns brackish. If such hazards were unpredictable, they would be especially terrifying. A place could seem safe one week and lethal the next. In that context, a policy of total exclusion becomes rational from a governance perspective. Better to forbid than to monitor constantly. Complete erasure becomes a way to simplify decision-making under uncertainty. The final development in this segment is the creation of substitute sacred geography. When a site is forbidden, people often create alternative places for memory and ritual. If pilgrims once visited a shrine in the plain, they might be redirected to another shrine. If offerings were once sent to a temple there, they might be reassigned to a temple elsewhere. The archive hints at reassigned obligations, suggesting that the religious economy adapted to the closure. That adaptation reduces the pressure to return. The closing image is tactile and quiet. A jar is wrapped, its mouth covered, string tightened, clay pressed over the knot, seal impressed twice by two different hands. A tablet is placed in a box closed, a lump of clay stamped to show no one has opened it. A gate is shut, and a phrase is spoken that turns closure into law. In that layered act, we feel the motive behind complete erasure. It is not only to end a city. It is to prevent contact, prevent claims, prevent contamination, prevent the dangerous possibility that the erased place might still function. The protocol of smoke is not about drama. It is about keeping the rest of the world operational. We leave the archive shelves and move into terrain, because geography is an argument that does not require language. It shapes what a crisis can become. It decides how quickly people can flee, where they can gather water, which routes can be controlled, and how a boundary can be enforced without building a wall. When a city is erased completely, the landscape often explains why totality is feasible, and why partial measures would fail. The southern plain is not a single surface. It is a set of zones that behave differently underfoot. There are hard ridges that carry paths. There are soft flats where wheels sink. There are salty crusts that look solid until they break. There are wadis that are empty most of the year, and then suddenly violent. The air itself can shift, sometimes clear and bright, sometimes hazy with dust and mineral shimmer. We do not need to name every feature to feel the administrative logic. A state that wants to isolate a place must understand corridors. It must understand choke points, wells, and passes. It must know where people must walk if they want to cross. And it must know where the land itself can become an enforcer. The first new development is the role of water as control. In dry regions, water points are not just resources. They are checkpoints. If a forbidden zone sits near a limited set of wells, then authorities can enforce exclusion by controlling those wells. They do not have to patrol the entire boundary. They only have to secure the water. The documents that redirect travel likely correspond to this reality. Rerouting is not abstract. It is a decision about which springs and cisterns will be used, which will be denied, and where caravans will be allowed to rest. This is one reason complete erasure becomes plausible. If the state can deny water access, any attempt at resettlement collapses quickly. Even strong motivation cannot overcome thirst for long. The land becomes a policy tool. The second development is the economics of salt, bitumen, and mineral resources. The plain is associated with materials that can be valuable for construction, preservation, ritual, and trade. Such materials create traffic. Traffic creates governance problems. If the state wants the zone silent, it must interrupt the resource economy. A partial closure would invite illegal extraction. People would sneak in, harvest, and leave. To stop that, a state needs either constant patrol or a story strong enough to discourage entry. Geography helps. If extraction requires moving through exposed flats with few hiding places, then monitoring becomes easier. If the land carries obvious tracks that can be spotted, enforcement becomes simpler. In that sense, the plain can function like a wide, bright page where movement leaves right in. The third development is hazard that is embedded in the ground. Some landscapes contain unpredictable dangers that feel like a living presence. Sudden collapses, pockets of gas, surface crust that fails, tar pits that trap. Even if we do not assign a specific modern mechanism, the lived experience of such terrain can shape policy. If a place regularly kills animals, and occasionally people, it becomes a liability. If it also carries a history of catastrophe, it can become taboo quickly. A taboo grounded in physical hazard is especially durable. Every new injury becomes a proof. The policy reinforces itself through accidents. Now we consider route logic. Trade routes prefer stability. They hug ridges, follow water, avoid soft ground. If a forbidden city sat near a key junction, then isolating it requires creating alternative junctions. That is an expensive administrative task. But the documents hint at exactly this: substitute hubs, alternate stations, new stopping points. Geography tells us how that could be accomplished. A small shift in route can move traffic away from the hazard zone while still preserving connectivity. The state can encourage this shift by investing in a new well, improving a road segment, or assigning guards to the new station. Over time, the old junction withers. The forbidden place becomes not only taboo, but irrelevant. This yields a quiet but important insight. Erasure is easier when the network can rewire itself. The next development concerns visibility. The plain is open in many places. Open terrain makes ambush difficult. It also makes unauthorized travel easier to detect. If authorities wanted to create an exclusion zone, open terrain would help them. A few watch posts on elevated ground could monitor movement. Travelers could be spotted from far away, and the absence of cover would discourage covert entry. Even without large forces, a state could enforce a boundary by leveraging sight. Visibility also supports storytelling. A place that can be seen from a distance but not entered becomes a powerful symbol, or people can point to it. They can warn children. They can say, "That is where you do not go." The land becomes an object lesson on the horizon. We now examine the psychology of edges. Where desert meets fertile land, boundaries are sharp. When a forbidden zone sits at such an edge, it functions as a buffer. It separates settled life from the more dangerous margins. If a city near that edge collapses into hazard, authorities may prefer to let the hazard expand rather than invest in reclaiming it. A ruined zone can serve as a barrier against raiders, rival polities, or uncontrolled movement. In this case, erasure has a strategic value. It creates empty space that absorbs pressure. That is another reason a place might have to be erased completely. Not because emptiness is morally satisfying, but because emptiness can be useful. The next development is the administrative handling of land that remains technically productive. Even a hazardous zone can produce grazing in certain seasons, or offer materials that people want. Complete erasure requires managing this temptation. Geography assists through seasonality, if the hazard is worst in certain months. Authorities can align prohibitions with those dangerous periods, then treat any entry as reckless. Over time, the prohibition becomes normalized year-round because it is safer and simpler. The seasonal hazard becomes a permanent rule. This is how policies harden. They begin as practical responses and become sacred boundaries. We also consider the nature of ruins. Ruins are magnets. They promise salvage: stone, timber, metal. In open plains, salvage operations are visible. That visibility makes them punishable. A state can deter salvage by making examples, but it can also deter salvage through ritual fear. If the ruins are said to carry impurity, then even valuable stone becomes unclean. The ground itself becomes a thief of legitimacy. This links geography to administration again. An exclusion zone that deters salvage prevents the circulation of materials that could become evidence or relics. If a leadership wants the erasure to remain complete, it may want to prevent artifacts from the city entering other towns. Such artifacts could carry stories, claims, or political symbols. Complete erasure includes controlling not only people and routes, but objects. The final development is the way the plane could distort memory. Dust covers footprints quickly, but salt preserves outlines in strange ways. A place can look unchanged across years, making it feel outside time. Such landscapes feed the sense that the area is marked permanently. That sense supports long-term taboo and long-term policy. The closing image is not fire. It is a route line on a mental map being redrawn around water points. It is guards posted where the ground turns from firm to treacherous. It is a caravan leader choosing the longer path because the shorter one passes near the dead zone. It is the land itself enforcing policy by refusing to support life easily. In that geography, complete erasure is not merely possible, it is efficient. It is a decision that uses water scarcity, open visibility, hazardous ground, and reroutable corridors to keep a place silent. The city becomes a hole in the network, and the landscape keeps the hole from being filled. We step into a single case file, not to narrow the world, but to make the pattern tactile. A region can be understood in policy language, but a settlement reveals what policy does to walls, storerooms, and the rhythm of daily administration. Here, the evidence takes the form of a site that changes its behavior over time, leaving behind layers that look like decisions. The settlement begins as many do, with logic. It sits where water can be accessed, where a route can be watched, where resources can be gathered. Its earliest phase shows ordinary competence, organized storage, consistent building lines, spaces that imply accounting, even without reading a single sign. The architecture suggests administration, rooms built for measuring, courtyards that can stage deliveries, thresholds that funnel traffic into predictable paths. A city like this is a machine for turning movement into order. Then the machine begins to change. The first new development is a shift in storage practices. In an ordinary growth trajectory, storage expands, becomes more specialized, and distributes across neighborhoods. In a closure trajectory, storage compresses and centralizes, as if the community is consolidating what it can manage. In the layers associated with stress, storerooms become crowded with mixed goods. Seals and ceilings appear in unusual concentrations near the main administrative spaces. Containers that would normally circulate seem to be gathered and held. This is the material signature of preparation, not collapse. The second development is the behavior of doors. Doors are not trivial. They tell us what rooms were meant to be accessed frequently and what rooms were meant to be restricted. In the phases that suggest a city becoming a liability, we see evidence of narrowed thresholds, blocked entrances, or altered circulation routes. Walls are added where passage once existed. It is as if the city is trying to control itself from the inside, reducing the number of ways goods and people can move. That matches the documentary impulse toward access control. But here, it is not words. It is brick and plaster. The third development is the treatment of official spaces. Administrative rooms often contain benches for scribes, platforms for storage of tablets, areas where ceilings fall and accumulate. In the closure phase, these spaces show signs of being emptied carefully, not stripped by looters, but cleared with intention. The absence is patterned. Certain types of items are missing in a way that suggests they were removed before the final abandonment. The city is not simply left, it is decommissioned. We also notice the fate of weights and measuring tools. These are the quiet heart of commerce. If they are taken away, it signals that the system has withdrawn the ability to conduct legitimate exchange. If they remain, exchange may have continued until the end. In this case file, the evidence leans toward removal or concentration, as if the tools were gathered for transfer. Now the case file introduces a different kind of evidence. Fire. Not the mythic fire of moral judgment, but physical burning that can be read in layers. Burn layers can be chaotic, associated with attack or accidental disaster. They can also be controlled, associated with clearing, sterilization, or intentional dismantling. The burn signatures here appear uneven. Some rooms are heavily burned, others are not. Some areas show signs of intense heat near storage zones. That unevenness suggests that fire was applied selectively, or that fuel loads differed by design. Selective burning can be an administrative act. Burn the records that should not circulate. Burn contaminated goods. Burn structures that might shelter squatters. Burn timber that might be salvaged and reused elsewhere. This is a new development because it reframes destruction as maintenance of closure. The city does not simply die. It is made hard to revive. The next development is the appearance of hurried modifications. In stable cities, repairs are careful. In stressed cities, repairs can be crude. We see patches that cover cracks quickly, walls reinforced in narrow places, temporary barriers built of mixed materials. These are not long-term investments. They are short-term adaptations, suggesting that the community knew it wasn't building for generations. It was buying time. Buying time for what? For departure. For negotiation, for managed withdrawal. We then consider population behavior. The archaeological signature of flight often includes valuables left behind, daily objects scattered, food stores abandoned. A managed evacuation looks different. It tends to remove valuables, gather portable assets, and leave behind heavier items. It can leave domestic spaces oddly clean, as if households packed deliberately. In this case file, the pattern leans toward deliberate departure. Not perfect, not total, but organized enough to suggest planning. That planning implies authority. Someone coordinated. Someone issued instructions. Someone controlled the distribution of rations during transition. Because departures without food become riots. We examine the boundary of the settlement. Walls and gates matter. A city that is being abandoned under threat may reinforce gates. A city that is being decommissioned may block gates to prevent re-entry. In the later phases, we see evidence that some entrances were obstructed, not by fallen rubble alone, but by deliberate infill. Blocking an entrance is a statement. The building is not meant to be used anymore. The case file also reveals a shift in ritual spaces. Shrines and sanctuaries are often among the last places a community abandons, because they anchor identity. In a managed withdrawal, sacred objects may be removed with ceremony, carried to new locations. The material signature can include empty pedestals, missing cult items, cleaned altars. If the shrine is burned or sealed, it suggests a deliberate ending. Here, the evidence suggests a careful removal rather than random desecration. This aligns with the idea that erasure is administrative, not purely punitive. Even when a place is declared void, the system may preserve continuity by moving the sacred center elsewhere. We then see the most unsettling development: the creation of abandonment markers. Some sites show signs that the last occupants left signals, not messages to enemies, but warnings to future settlers. These can be as simple as leaving debris in entrances, collapsing roofs intentionally, or scattering materials that make habitation unpleasant. In some traditions, impurity is manufactured through deliberate mixing of waste with domestic space. Even without that extreme, the act of making a place difficult to occupy is a form of policy enforcement. If the goal is complete erasure, discouraging reoccupation is essential. The closing image in this case file is quiet. A final inventory is counted. Seals are collected. Portable authority is packed. The scribal bench is emptied. The doorways are narrowed. Some rooms are burned. Some gates are blocked. The city is left not as an accident, but as a deliberate absence. It is transformed into a liability that is being neutralized. In this way, the case file helps us understand why erasure must be complete. Partial abandonment invites return. Return invites dispute. Dispute invites the reactivation of a compromised node. Complete erasure closes the loop. It denies the future a foothold. It makes the city not only dead, but administratively unreachable, materially inconvenient, and ritually unsafe. We turn to witness texts that do not look like bureaucracy at first glance, because societies often store their most durable instructions inside beauty. When policy needs to outlive officials, it migrates into songs, laments, proverbs, and warning stories. These genres sound emotional, but they can carry procedure like a sealed order hidden inside cloth. The result is a double record, one written for offices, one written for hearts, The first development here is the way laments preserve logistics. A lament is not an audit. It doesn't list weights and rations. It cries for what is lost. Yet laments often include details that only make sense if the community remembers processes. Gates closed, storehouses emptied, officials departing, priests carrying objects away, roads falling silent. These are not merely poetic images. They are operational memories, rendered in a voice that people will keep repeating. In the lament style, the city is described as a place where the normal exchange of goods and words has stopped. There is attention to silence in markets, emptiness in courtyards, and the absence of officials who used to sit and judge. The text suggests not only destruction, but the removal of governance. That aligns with erasure as deactivation. The second development is the way warning narratives encode access control. Wisdom texts and cautionary stories often include phrases that function like boundary signs. Do not approach. Do not look back. Do not take what belongs to the forbidden place. Do not linger. These instructions can appear moral, but they are also practical. They teach children and travelers how to behave near a restricted zone. They turn compliance into virtue. This is not speculation about motives. It is an observation about how cultures transmit rules. A guard can stop you once. A story can stop you for life. The third development is the presence of contamination language in moral form. Many traditions frame danger as impurity, and impurity spreads through contact. In these texts, the forbidden city is not just wrong, it is unclean. Its soil is suspect. Its objects are dangerous. Even its memory can be framed as a risk. This is not simply condemnation. It is quarantine logic translated into ethics. If the community believes contact contaminates, then the simplest safe behavior is total avoidance. The policy becomes self-enforcing. The fourth development is the way witness texts preserve the concept of irreversible status. Administrative records can declare a place inactive. Witness texts can declare it unreturnable. They do this by emphasizing finality, not simply that the city was punished, but that the punishment created a permanent condition. The land is described as unusable, barren, altered. The emphasis is not on spectacle, but on permanence. The point is to teach that rebuilding is not an option, that resettlement is not a path. This is how complete erasure is maintained across generations. The public learns that return is not merely forbidden, it is futile. We now consider a different genre, the legal style tale. Some narratives present a city's fall as a case decision, with a moral logic that resembles court procedure, indictment, evidence of wrongdoing, refusal to change, verdict, enforcement. The structure teaches listeners how judgment works, but it also teaches them how policy works. Repeated warnings, opportunities for compliance, then closure. This legal rhythm helps people accept hard decisions. If the story tells them the city was warned repeatedly, then the final erasure feels justified. Justification matters because unjust policies provoke resistance, and resistance reopens the closed file. Another development emerges in the role of outsiders. Witness texts sometimes position a traveler or a stranger as the one who recognizes danger. The stranger is told to leave quickly, to avoid contact, to carry no goods from the place. This outsider perspective functions like a travel advisory. It addresses people who are not part of the local administration. It spreads the boundary rule beyond the state's immediate control. If traders and pilgrims internalize the warning, enforcement becomes easier. We then notice the subtle way these texts treat material objects. There are recurring cautions about taking items from the forbidden city. This has a logistical function. If objects circulate, they carry stories and claims. An item could become evidence that someone has rights to return. It could become a relic that attracts visitors. It could become a valuable that tempts salvage. By framing salvage as morally dangerous, the community reduces the flow of objects from the zone into ordinary markets. That supports complete erasure by preventing the city from re-entering daily life through things. The next development concerns memory management. Some witness texts do a strange thing. They remember the city intensely while insisting it should not be approached. This is not a contradiction. It is a control mechanism. The community uses memory to enforce distance. The city becomes a boundary marker in the mind, a reference point for what is not allowed. The more vivid the memory, the stronger the avoidance. In this way, erasure is not the same as forgetting. It is the transformation of the city into a controlled symbol, one that has a single authorized meaning. When memory is controlled, unauthorized interpretations are less likely to take root. We also see hints of displaced populations inside these texts. Sometimes the sorrow is not only for buildings, but for families scattered. The texts may refer to wandering, to loss of home, to the search for shelter. These are human experiences, but they also reflect administrative realities, resettlement, rationing, assignment to new communities. Witness texts make these experiences speakable. They give people a way to accept relocation as part of a meaningful story. That reduces the chance that displaced groups will organize to return. Another development is the way place names can be altered or avoided. Some traditions refuse to speak a forbidden name directly, using descriptors instead. The effect is to reduce the city's specificity. It becomes a type, rather than a location. That shift matters. A specific location invites maps and return. A type invites caution without coordinates. By turning Sodom into an archetype, the culture makes actual resettlement harder because the physical target becomes less clear in communal imagination. Even if some people still know the location, the general population lives with a blurred map. The closing image is intimate. A family sits at night and an elder tells a story. The tone is calm, serious. The story teaches the children not to take certain paths, not to accept certain goods, not to mock boundaries. The story also provides a reason. The city became something that couldn't be allowed to remain in the world as a functioning place. In that sense, witness texts are not merely moral commentary. They are part of the containment apparatus. They are the soft enforcement layer that makes complete erasure stable. They preserve the shape of administrative decisions in a form that can be carried without tablets, without seals, without guards. They travel on breath and repetition, keeping a forbidden zone closed long after the last official order is buried. We consider what complete erasure protects, because policies of total removal are rarely about a single city alone. They are about the surrounding system that must remain functional. When an authority chooses to make a place uninhabitable in practice and unreachable in law, it is not only ending a community, it is shielding networks of trade, ritual, and legitimacy from a disruption that might otherwise spread. The first new development is the concept of continuity elsewhere. In administrative thinking, the most important asset is not a building. It is predictability. A state can survive a lost town if its accounting continues. Its temples receive offerings, its armies receive rations, and its courts continue to adjudicate. A catastrophic city can threaten predictability by creating endless exceptions, refugees, missing taxes, disputed properties, contested routes, interrupted supply chains. Complete erasure can be a tool for removing exceptions. It is a brutal simplification. It declares that a certain part of the map no longer generates obligations. This protects the rest of the ledger. The second development is the management of blame. When systems face crisis, blame is not just emotion, it is governance. If people do not know why disaster struck, they generate competing explanations, and competing explanations become factions. A single authoritative narrative reduces factionalism. It gives the public a shared frame. If the city is erased and blamed, the wider society can stabilize around a simple moral boundary. The narrative can channel fear into compliance instead of rebellion. Complete erasure, then, protects political cohesion by limiting interpretive chaos. The third development is trade stability. Trade routes are fragile because they depend on trust. Merchants must believe that markets exist, that weights are honest, that roads are safe, that stations will not become traps. A city associated with hazard, fraud, or violence can poison confidence in the entire corridor. By erasing the city and forbidding contact, authorities can signal to merchants that the risk is contained. The message is not only, do not go there. The message is, you can still go everywhere else. The corridor remains open because the infected node has been isolated. This is containment as reassurance. The fourth development is ritual continuity. Temples and shrines are not only spiritual, they are economic and administrative hubs. They store goods, issue rations, manage labor. If a city's ritual center is compromised, and if impurity fear spreads, nearby temples may lose trust. Offerings may decline. Pilgrims may avoid the whole region. By defining the hazard zone narrowly and declaring it erased, authorities can protect the legitimacy of other sanctuaries. They can redirect offerings, maintain calendars, and reassure communities that sacred life continues in clean spaces. Complete erasure can therefore protect holiness as a stable public resource. The fifth development concerns archives themselves. Record systems are vulnerable to contamination in a social sense. A flood of disputed claims, forged documents, and conflicting testimonies can paralyze courts and storehouses. When a city collapses under unusual conditions, its documents become dangerous. People can use them to claim property. They can forge them to seize rations. They can argue endlessly over whether obligations still apply. The administrative solution can be to void the city's documentary output, to declare it non-binding, to treat it as dead paper. This protects the archive from overload. The sixth development is what might be called narrative contamination. Stories travel with refugees, traders, and survivors. If the story of the city becomes too complex, too ambiguous, it can weaken the authority of those who manage the crisis. Competing stories can suggest that leadership failed, that the disaster was preventable, or that certain factions were responsible. Total erasure paired with a strong moral narrative can simplify memory and reduce the spread of destabilizing versions. The city becomes a caution, not a political dispute. This protects leadership by controlling the emotional economy of the crisis. Now we examine how this protection works on the ground. When a place is erased, the state can implement substitution. It can assign a new market town. It can open a new station. It can promote a different shrine. It can reroute caravans through a controlled corridor. Substitution is not just infrastructure. It is psychological. People need a place to go. If the forbidden zone leaves a vacuum, the vacuum attracts return attempts. Substitution fills the vacuum with sanctioned alternatives. This is another reason for complete erasure. It clears the space needed for replacement structures to gain authority. We also consider the protection of borders. A forbidden plain can act as a buffer zone between polities or between settled land and the margins. Buffer zones reduce raids, slow armies, and complicate unauthorized movement. If a city sat in a buffer position and became unstable, erasing it might strengthen the buffer by turning it into empty, feared land. In this case, erasure protects security. It creates strategic distance. The next development is the social handling of refugees. Displacement is dangerous because it creates mobile populations with uncertain status. Such populations can become recruitment pools for rebels or bandits. Authorities often respond by assigning refugees to labor projects, distributing them across multiple towns, and tracking them carefully. Complete erasure helps this process by cutting off the possibility of collective return. If return remains plausible, refugees may resist integration. If return is framed as forbidden and futile, integration becomes the only path. This protects social order in the host communities. We then examine a quieter kind of protection of moral boundaries in everyday life. Communities need stories that tell them where the line is, not only in law, but in behavior. A city that is erased and remembered as a caution becomes a tool for teaching. Parents warn children, elders warn leaders. The story becomes a template for how to interpret disorder. This template can reduce panic in future crises by offering a familiar frame. Complete erasure protects meaning by making one example absolute. Finally, we consider the possibility that the erasure protects something hidden. Not hidden in a conspiratorial sense, but hidden in a practical sense. If the disaster involved conditions that leadership could not control, such as unpredictable hazards, then acknowledging the full complexity might undermine confidence. By framing the event as moral judgment and enforcing complete erasure, authorities avoid public discussion of vulnerabilities. They do not have to admit that the land can betray them, that infrastructure can fail. That power has limits. The erased city becomes the place where complexity is buried. This protects the image of control. The closing image is administrative and quiet. A set of ledgers is balanced by removing an entry. A ritual calendar continues because offerings are reassigned. A trade route remains trusted because a single node is declared forbidden. A court moves forward because claims from the dead zone are dismissed. In this light, the reason for complete erasure is not simply that the city was bad. It is that the city's continued existence, even as a ruin, threatened too many systems at once. The erasure protects the living network by making the damaged node non-interactive. It is containment, simplification, and narrative stabilization, all pressed into one harsh decision. We bring the evidence into a single, careful motive, not as a final claim, but as a quiet convergence. The pattern suggests that complete erasure was chosen because a city can become more dangerous as a half-living thing than as a silence. A ruin invites salvage. A surviving name invites claims. A remembered route invites movement. A disputed story invites factions. If the goal is stability, the most severe option is to make the place non-interactive in every domain: physical, legal, economic, and spiritual. The first new development is the recognition that erasure is multi-layer. Physical destruction alone does not erase a city. People can rebuild. They can squat. They can reopen wells. They can trade in the shadow of ruins. Legal erasure alone does not erase a city. People can still live there, even if their contracts are not recognized. Narrative erasure alone does not erase a city. The land remains. The ruins remain. Complete erasure requires synchronization of layers, the kind of synchronization that only a coordinated authority can attempt. This insight reframes the story. The reason for complete erasure is not a single cause. It is the need to close all routes of reactivation. The second development is the role of time. In many disasters, time heals. Fields recover, populations return, memories soften. Complete erasure is a decision to deny time its usual work. It interrupts the natural drift toward resettlement. It forces permanence. That requires ongoing reinforcement, restrictions, prohibitions, replacement hubs, and stories that keep the boundary sharp. This means the erasure is not only a moment. It is an ongoing posture. The third development is the identification of a trigger condition that would justify permanence. From an administrative viewpoint, permanence is expensive. It requires constant cultural maintenance and occasional enforcement. So what would justify it? The evidence suggests a trigger condition that can be described in several ways, but has a common shape. The location became a source of uncontrolled consequences. Uncontrolled consequences can include hazard that spreads through contact, disputes that spread through paperwork, factionalism that spreads through narrative, and instability that spreads through movement. When consequences are uncontrolled, partial solutions fail. The system responds with totality. Complete erasure is the policy of last resort when containment must be absolute. The fourth development is the quiet recognition that moral language can be a tool rather than the sole explanation. A society can interpret disaster as judgment and still implement the response as logistics. Moral language helps ensure compliance. It makes avoidance feel righteous. It turns a boundary into a duty. This is not cynical. It is how communities fuse meaning with survival. The moral frame is the public layer that makes the operational layer durable. The fifth development is the concept of contested memory. If a city's fall can be interpreted in multiple ways, then memory becomes a battlefield. Competing memories can call for different actions: return, revenge, reclamation, denial. Is total erasure resolves contested memory by narrowing it to one sanctioned lesson. The city becomes not a place to argue about, but a signpost that protects society from internal division. Now we come to the detail that remains unresolved, the one that keeps the investigation alive even when the pattern looks coherent. In the administrative traces of closure, there is often a small inconsistency, a minor shipment that does not match the prohibition, a personal name that appears near the forbidden zone in a later list, a reference to a well or a station that suggests limited access under special permission. These inconsistencies are not mistakes. They are the imprint of reality pushing against policy. They suggest that complete erasure was never perfectly complete. A state can forbid, but people still hunger, people still risk. Merchants still calculate profit. Refugees still dream of home. Priests still wondered if a sacred object was left behind. Officials still accept bribes. Complete erasure is an aspiration, a hard line drawn on a living world that keeps trying to cross. This is the final new development, the difference between declared erasure and practiced erasure. Declared erasure is what the record wants. Practiced erasure is what enforcement can achieve. The gap between them is where human behavior lives. And in that gap, we find the most human reason for totality. The harsher the declaration, the more it tries to crush the gap, the more it insists, the more it reveals that return is a persistent temptation. If a city had to be completely erased, it may be because partial measures were repeatedly undermined. People kept going back. People kept trading. People kept trying to reopen a node that leaders judged too dangerous. Each violation would reinforce the need for stronger taboo, stronger enforcement, stronger story. Complete erasure, then, is not only a response to what happened in the city. It is a response to what people kept trying to do afterward. We gather the quiet hypothesis in one calm sentence. If we read the evidence as layered procedure, Sodom was erased completely because its continued partial presence threatened the operational continuity of the wider system, and only total deactivation across material, legal, and narrative domains could contain the risk. We do not claim certainty. We simply note that this reading fits the administrative obsession with closure, the landscape logic of boundaries, the witness texts that teach avoidance, and the institutional impulse to protect ledgers, temples, and roots. The closing image is not thunder. It is a clerk pressing a seal into clay, not once, but twice, as if he knows the future will test this decision. It is a guard turning travelers away at a water point. It is a parent teaching a child not to take a certain path. It is a storyteller repeating the same moral shape until it becomes automatic. The city becomes a controlled absence, maintained by policy and by memory, because the cost of letting it remain partially alive was judged too high. The room grows quieter now. The archive lamp is dimmer in our imagination, and the clay feels cooler again, as if it has been resting on stone. We can let the details settle without forcing them into certainty. In careful investigations, especially the kind we do at night, the point is not to pin a single final answer to the board. The point is to notice how many small decisions can add up to a silence that lasts. A city can vanish in many ways. It can be burned and left. It can be abandoned and forgotten. But complete erasure is different. It is a kind of continuous choosing. Each generation repeats the boundary. Each official repeats the refusal. Each traveler repeats the detour. Each parent repeats the warning. The land itself helps, with its harsh surfaces and its scarce water, making the forbidden route feel less like an option and more like a mistake. If you are listening from somewhere quiet tonight, you can let that idea soften. The people who wrote these procedures and told these stories were not made of stone. They were trying to keep their world workable. They were trying to keep trade honest, ritual clean, families fed, and disputes from multiplying. Their methods could be severe. Their explanations could be moral. Their fears could be practical. And still, beneath all of it, the human impulse is recognizable. Protect what can be protected, even if it means closing a place so tightly that it becomes a blank. We can leave the ruined plain at the edge of the map now, not as a spectacle, but as a lesson in how systems respond when something becomes too dangerous to keep interacting with. The light fades, the shelves stand silent, the story becomes slower, like breathing. End of script. Good night.